Hello friends, and welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. Last time we finished off the Desert Palace and Tower of Hera, meaning we can finally start into the dungeons of the Dark World. But as usual, there's a few pre-dungeon things to get out of the way first. After we've obtained the Master Sword, we'll get a telepathic message from Zelda, who gets attacked at the sanctuary where we left her. Yep, she gets kidnapped as it turns out. So we need to storm Hyrule Castle again, this time breaking through this energy barrier and ascending up the castle tower. Now, I considered covering this section of the castle as another video on its own, just like I did with Wind Waker's Forsaken Fortress. However, in terms of level design, there isn't much to talk about here. Don't get me wrong, battling our way through the castle is very fun, and the right call for pacing at this point in the game's narrative. It feels great to cut our way through enemies using our new sword, which deals twice the damage, especially these harder soldiers. It shows us how much Link, and by extension we as the player, have grown in strength since the onset of our adventure. I really like it. It feels incredibly satisfying, but the path we take is as linear as it gets, and it's almost all just rooms of enemies, a locked door, and then a room of enemies, a door opens, rinse, repeat. The thrill comes from the feeling of triumph as we one-man army our way up the castle tower, but the puzzles and deviations in the path just aren't there. Again, this is not a complaint. Linearity is not inherently a bad thing in game design. It just means that there isn't a lot for me to discuss here. That said, at the top, we do get to battle Aghanim, which is the series' first ever occurrence of Dead Man's Volley, which is always fun. I love this trope and I'll never get tired of it. After that, we're pulled into the Dark World, where we make our way to the Palace of Darkness, a sinister reflection of how we began our journey in the Light World. Very suiting for our first voyage into the dungeons of the Dark World. So with all of that out of the way, once we've paid the monkey toll, we can head into the dungeon. Welcome to the Palace of Darkness, which, aside from sounding like what a 12-year-old edgelord would call their bedroom, is actually a pretty solid and well-rounded dungeon. We have lots of movement options, branching paths, and multiple routes to take through this multi-floored palace, which is awesome. While not as iconic as, say, the Forest Temple from Ocarina of Time, I feel the Palace of Darkness accomplishes something similar, being the first dungeon in the game's second act. It feels like this dungeon, in the same way as the Forest Temple, is where things get real. While the dungeons of the Light World were all fairly short and not too challenging, here is where they start to get really creative with the navigation and the puzzles, and the difficulty starts to ramp up. I love dungeons where you have to stop and think about what you're doing in each room while keeping the overall layout of the dungeon as a larger whole in the back of your mind. And this feels to me like the first instance in A Link to the Past where that is the case. For real, I've played this game so many times over the years, but I still occasionally hit a locked door and have to go exploring for keys in this dungeon. And I love that. The use of verticality that was introduced to us in the Tower of Hera makes a comeback here again, as well as the red-blue gem switch barriers, which make for some neat navigational puzzles, especially paired with the one-way paths in the form of these little jumps. From an exploration standpoint, having a dungeon like this where you have to always consider how you approach each room is a real treat. A quick side note as usual, but the music here gets a mix-up again. Sadly, every Dark World dungeon shares this piece, so it starts to grow pretty tiresome for me by the time we're in some of the later dungeons. But giving it an honest listen while writing this video has been interesting. It's a sinister piece, it's dramatic and dangerous. It always feels like it's building up towards a jump scare that just doesn't quite happen, which works in the context of the Dark World for me. I like the the idea of danger always being just around the corner, and this song fits the bill for sure. It's just a shame that it gets so overused, especially since, for me, it's just not quite as good a track as the Light World dungeon theme. Ah well, moving on. As mentioned earlier, there's a lot of explorable space here, and that is the case right from the start. The foyer room parallels the Eastern Palace with its 3 doors, but unlike that dungeon, we actually have somewhere to go beyond those 3 doors, rather than 2 of them just being dead ends. And each path is meaningful. The left path hides the key, the right one has another key as well as the dungeon map, and the center route is the critical path, taking you into the dungeon's central chambers. I like that this center route is locked initially, forcing you to explore either of these ungated side paths first. It really reinforces that idea that you have to be on the lookout for hidden stuff, rather than just blindly pushing forward. And I like that you can do these side routes in either order. Just like the Eastern Palace, this dungeon also does a great job of incentivizing exploration by teasing you with visible things that are out of reach. For example, if you drop down the bridge into this floor below, you can spot this locked door on the upper ledge, forcing you to consider the physical space around you, and where you need to drop down properly to reach that ledge. Likewise, we have a handful of treasure chests tucked on ledges and balconies, teasing us by being visible but out of reach. This is the sort of thing that 2D games can do really well, since 3D games tend to have a more limited field of view. Not to say that they can't or don't achieve this, but it's something that is easier to accomplish in a 2D plane with a top-down camera like this. This is most effectively used in 2 places within this dungeon: the big chest, and of course the chest in the center of this room with the big key, which combines those 2 aforementioned concepts of dropping into the room below and the payoff being you finding that key in the chest that was out of reach before. The big chest works just as well though, since you can see it on this balcony while crossing this collapsing bridge. The bridge ends with a fork in the road, but because we were teased with that treasure chest, we are incentivized to explore the left path to try and make our way over to it before heading down the right path. Which is good because that chest contains the dungeon item, the hammer. This is the game that would make this such a series staple. The hammer is a very fun item with good utility. While it did appear first in Zelda 2, that game only made use of it to smash obstacles in the overworld. It never got put to use inside of a dungeon or during combat. Here, meanwhile, we get some more real-time application of the item. The hammer makes enemies that you couldn't damage before, in particular these punnily named guys called terror pins, very easy to defeat, so there's some immediate satisfaction there. That, and we can now make progress down the critical path by flattening these obstacles. This is my favorite way for a Zelda title to use a dungeon item. You make some gameplay element like an enemy a little irritating, which the dungeon item then makes easier to overcome, and you have obstacles that can be encountered but only overcome once the item is in hand. It makes acquiring and using said item just so satisfying. It's at this point that the dungeon falls back into the same structure as the Eastern Palace. Once we've overcome and explored this large, open, and interconnected area, the next section is a straightforward linear path leading up to the boss fight. I've talked the idea to death at this point, I'm sure, but it is still worth a mention here. At least this section works to reinforce mechanics used earlier in the dungeon, with gem switch barriers, more terror pins, and barriers to flatten down with the hammer. It's a pretty short section all in all, so it isn't the meat of the dungeon by any means, but it makes the lead up towards the boss fight feel dramatic. Alright, with all of that out of the way, once we've made our way through these dark passageways, we can confront the dungeon boss. Entering the boss room, we'll come face to face with the Helmasaur King, our first Dark World boss. The Helmasaur King is simply a visually striking and imposing boss. I love this guy. He looks so dangerous. Essentially, he's a giant version of the Helmasaurs that we encountered and fought throughout the dungeon. But you know, he's a big boy. Plus, he's got a great variety of attacks. This fight at times almost starts to feel bullet hellish, but never in an extremely overwhelming way. He's pretty slow, but he'll launch these fire attacks, stomp around, and try to strike you with his scorpion-like tail. The scope of this fight is great, and I like that there's just as much an emphasis on you needing to avoid his attacks and stay alive as there is on you being aggressive and needing to deal damage yourself. It's good stuff. Unlike the previous couple of bosses, this battle has some great dungeon item integration, making use of the hammer to break his mask and expose his weak spot. It's a very fun concept that would be revisited in Wind Waker's Helmarock King, but the idea is just as satisfying here. It's great getting the visual and audio feedback as your hammer strikes chip away and ultimately shatter his mask apart. Satisfaction. From there, it's just a matter of striking that weak point to take him down. It's not the most mechanically complex fight, and honestly, you'll probably take him down pretty quickly, but the fight is satisfying and fun to do, while remaining a reasonable challenge. And for a boss fight around the early middle section of the game, that's kind of the sweet spot. It's really well done. Though I think the cluster of blade traps at the back end of the room is kind of weird and pointless. I'm not sure why they're there, since you probably won't even be in that part of the room during the fight yourself. Is the boss just flexing to us how tough he is by standing on them? I don't know. Regardless, this is a very engaging boss fight. Just the right amount of challenge for where it's placed in the game, 2 phases, and excellent use of the dungeon item. All around, very well done. Once he's defeated, we'll get our heart container as usual, as well as the first crystal, which releases the first of the 7 maidens. That's 1 down, 7 more to go. So that's the dungeon. Overall, while taking notes for this video during my play session, I've actually gained a newfound appreciation for how well designed this dungeon really is. It's one of those levels that I've often overlooked in favor of more iconic dungeons, but it really does a great job of balancing its ideas and having some fun little challenges. A few more thoughts before we wrap this up though. This large explorable space that makes up the first 2/3 of the dungeon is such a joy to comb through. I love how many doors are in each room and how so many sections of this dungeon intersect with one another. It makes navigation really fun, especially combining the one-way paths in the form of these little jumps and these push blocks with the gem switch barriers introduced to us in the Tower of Hera. Although these hard hat beetles are still here and they're as annoying as ever, but from a navigational standpoint, it's really cool. I'm sure there are people who find this room downright annoying, but I like that you have to be smart and consider not just how you traverse through the room, but also what color barriers are up in here. Though the puzzle aspect of it does get somewhat trivialized when you realize that you can cheese it all by using a bomb to trigger the gem switch after passing by some of the barricades. But still, even if you didn't figure that out, it isn't too difficult to make a pass through the previous room and enter in the other side. I also like the Goria introduced in this dungeon. Their NES counterparts aren't really that mechanically interesting, or very different from enemies like Moblins and Lizalfos, so they never really stood out to me in Zelda 1 and 2. Here in A Link to the Past, they have their own behaviors compared to other enemies. They always move in direct response to you, mirroring your movements. So it's like a puzzle and combat scenario rolled into one, and it's really satisfying to line up a shot from your bow just right and take these guys out. Speaking of puzzles, this wall moving one is another neat one. We saw a similar payoff in the Desert Palace with its own wall moving puzzle, but this time we have to shoot the eye of this Igor statue. Shooting eyeball things is sort of a Zelda staple, and is just one of those puzzle solutions that I've always known, so I may be biased here. I'm trying to reflect on how one would figure this out organically, and I guess the clue being that this is green, like the Igors that we've battled earlier. In fact, the only Igor statue that is green at all would probably be enough for players to catch on. But again, that's sort of my speculation. This is one of those puzzles that I just know, and I don't even know how I know it. I just always have. Last thing to mention, while I think overall this dungeon has an excellent sense of interconnectivity and navigational freedom, it does feel at times like it relies a little too heavily on these teleportation pads. They're not a concept I'm particularly fond of, but that may be in part due to how they're implemented here. Having so many of these, especially the ones in the critical path, makes use of the map feel a little undermined. It's weird when you find a room that looks like a dead end on the map, but it has a teleport pad connecting it to another room. I don't always mind it, like in this room below where you find the big key. I also don't mind it for convenience sake in some secret rooms, like some of the fairy fountains in the previous dungeons, but you're forced to use a couple of these during the side paths from the foyer, and again in the critical path leading up to the boss fight. And it makes the map design feel disjointed in a way that I'm not fond of. If the map had a way to mark where those teleport pads connected, then I don't think I'd be as bothered by it. Ultimately, given the scope of this dungeon, it is pretty minor, and nowhere near a deal breaker. But there are definitely spots where I feel like a staircase would accomplish the same thing, but feel more natural with the dungeon layout. It is more or less the same complaint I had with the excess of underground stairways in level 9 of Zelda 1, but not nearly as confusing here, thanks to the variety in room layouts and designs. But overall, this dungeon is still a very fun experience. While I still feel the teleportation pads make using the map a little harder to do, it's not a deal breaker by any means. The dungeon has a great multi-floor puzzle and a sense of navigation that is excellent. I appreciate how many routes there are through this dungeon, how many of these rooms connect and loop back, and how well they incentivize you to explore thoroughly. The use of treasure chests and other visible areas teasing us are great for steering you in the right direction, and it's genuinely rewarding to explore through here and collect all of these keys before heading down the path towards the boss fight. It may still not be my favorite dungeon in A Link to the Past, but while working on this video, I've grown to like it a lot. Thank you all so much for watching. Before we end this off, I just wanted to say thank you to the lovely people who supported me on Patreon or here on YouTube as a channel member, including but not limited to Grey Mage, Brenda, Tetra, Callie, Gail, Hylian West, Justin, Clifford Longhead, Midnight Naomi, and Bunny. Thank you all so much for the support and for watching, and I will catch you all next time. Bye-bye.